On behalf of the Speakers Bureau, we are really happy to have brought this speaker out to get to know you and to speak with you about the travails of an empire. Lawrence Wilkerson has a very extensive background. His last positions in government were as Secretary of State of Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff from 2002 to 2005. Before serving at the State Department, Wilkerson served 31 years in the United States Army. Wilkerson retired from active service in 1997 as a colonel and began work as an advisor to General Powell. He is currently working on a book about the first George W. Bush administration and is also a professor at the William & Mary University. Let's welcome
Thank you. I'm told that because of technical matters, I have to stay up here. This is a pretty good audience. I appreciate your all turning out, especially since the weather's pretty good, for Houston anyway. I can say that because I went to high school here and used to do August football practice, where I'd watch at least one student every year collapse and be carried away. Hot place, humid place, but with some really warm hospitality, and I appreciate your all being here tonight. The subject that I want to speak on is a subject that I've spoken on all across the globe. To our Canadian friends to the north, to our Mexicanos amigos to the south, to the Germans, to the French, to the British, to the Turks, to the Chinese, to the Japanese, to the Koreans, and a number of others. And mind you, most of them, even those who might be our erstwhile enemies, such as China, Russia, most of them are uneasy about the message I deliver. Our allies, like Japan, England, France, Germany, Turkey, are very uneasy about the message I deliver. And usually I get extensive question and answer periods with them. Some of them I know from long service in government, like China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, or like the current Chancellor in Germany, or like the government in England right now. Some of them I don't know at all, but I recognize their credentials for what they represent in that particular ally, friend, or potential enemy. And it grieves me to deliver the message that I'm delivering, particularly to our allies and our friends. And to a certain extent, it grieves me that I see consternation on the face of those that might constitute potential enemies in the world when they hear what I have to say, because they have their own motives, their own incentives, and sometimes they're quite different from the way they're portrayed in our corporately owned media, and quite different from the way we interpret them in Washington. You'll understand more about what I'm saying as I go on. When I start my seminars at William & Mary, I usually look at my students and I do one of two things. I either point to the portrait in the back of the seminar room, which is a portrait of a young man who died in Afghanistan in 2009 as a first lieutenant in the United States Army, but who was a William & Mary graduate. Outstanding cadet in the ROTC that year, distinguished graduate, outstanding young man who was majoring in Russia studies, spoke fluent Russian. And from everything I've been able to learn about him, an outstanding American all around. He was killed after 2 months in Afghanistan leading his company. And I make sure that my students understand that when I'm telling them that that is the ultimate price of war. That is the precious price we pay to use the military instrument in the world. The other way I start my seminars, and sometimes I do both, is to say, who in this seminar can tell me where it is written in granite that the American empire is forever? And then after I get no response, and I never do, I get downcast looks, I get nods, I get looks of perplexity and bafflement, but I never get an answer. This is 10 years of 2 seminars a semester, roughly, for 2 semesters a year. Add the George Washington University, where I taught for 6 years, similar responses. And then I ask, because there is no response, I wait a second just to see. I ask, where is it written in history that any empire has survived? Is there any empire alive today that was alive 100 years ago and an empire? Where is the British Empire today? Where's the 1,000-year Reich? They don't have an answer for that either, but that usually starts a discussion. And it might go any one of several ways, but one of the most common is we're not an empire. Therefore, your statements are irrelevant. I'm sorry, we are an empire. By all measures of imperial power, we are an empire. We're not necessarily an empire of tradition, that is to say territorial aggrandizement. Powell used to say all the time, we ask for nothing for our dedication to your security except enough territory, enough ground to bury our dead. Well, that's true to only a certain extent, and we used to debate this. We have at one time had 3,000 plus bases in foreign territory in 90 countries. Today we've pared that down somewhat, but we still have major installations, 300, and if you throw them all in there, over 1,000. And we're in something like 60 countries. And I'm not even counting some of the lesser entities that only constitute 4 or 5 people at any given time. And I'm also counting, and I'll list it differently, that we have special operating forces training forces in the world to do various things in over 90 countries. And what are they doing? They're basically training them to fight counter-terrorist actions, tactics, against, quote, terrorists, unquote, in their country. And what are they actually doing with that money and that training that we're giving them? Well, many times they are suppressing or oppressing their own people with that money, with that training, rather than fighting any terrorists. In some cases, they're doing both. In almost no case are they doing exactly what we're giving them the money for. This is not a template we are unaware of. We did this all during the Cold War in the name of anti-communism. We supported dictators all around the world with money and arms and training so long as they would declare themselves anti-communist. They weren't necessarily fighting the communists. They were more often keeping themselves in power. But it worked, and we won the Cold War and secured our empire. The only problem is the empire is in deep, deep trouble, as all empires throughout human history have been in toward their end. That end can be, as with Rome, 400 years, some would argue, in the being or in the making, especially if you count the Eastern Empire as an extension and a survival element in the overall empire. Or it can be as brief, as I just mentioned, as the 1,000-year Reich. Hitler's empire, after all, didn't last 1,000 years. My argument would be that the complexity of current events, the complexity of what modernity means, has accelerated the life and growth of states in general, but empires in particular. And that we can easily see not the usual life of empire, which most historians will put down as somewhere between 100 and 300 years, but a very accelerated demise for the current empire of the United States. And even as Neil Ferguson has pointed out in a foreign affairs article not too long ago, we might even see what he would call, I think, a chaotic end. That is to say, on Monday you go to sleep and everything's okay, and on Tuesday morning you wake up and it's all gone. It could happen that fast, because that's the nature of this acceleration that we're experiencing in these times. So what do you might say, you might ask, what do you see as the signs of this demise, of these travails, of these problems, of this end of empire? Well, the first and most prominent one is that empires tend to be powers that want the status quo forever. And we all know that nature, the science we know and so forth, says that's an impossibility. That is counter to everything we see in life. But that's what empires want. They want the status quo forever. They don't want anything to change. And they are willing to use force of arms to make sure that that writ is carried out. So what you see markedly at the end of most empires in human history is a concentration on and a use of the military instrument, the instrument of force, rather than the other instruments that are in our arsenal. What are those other instruments? Well, they're diplomacy, their politics, their financial and economic means, their culture, their information. There are all kinds of tools in our kit bag. The military is only one of them. But empires concentrate at the end on military force as the end-all and be-all of power. They also keep massive standing military forces. They don't stand them down, they keep them. They also create complexes to support those military forces, whether it be Egyptians who grew the crops or whether it be metalsmiths who made the swords or whatever. They keep this sort of infrastructure very prominent and intact and reward it majorly in order to keep the military instrument honed and ready to go. And interestingly, too, they generally wind up at the end using more mercenary forces than they do citizen-based forces. These are all signs of the dissipation of power, the end of empire, the end of imperial reign. They also do something else. They go bankrupt. And I don't mean just physically, that is monetarily. They go ethically and morally bankrupt. They wind up, for example, with less than 1% of their population, and it's usually a mercenary percent, bleeding and dying and defending the other 99%. Sound familiar? They usually wind up with bankers and financiers running the real power instruments in the empire. Sound familiar? They usually wind up with great hiccups in that financial and economic and trade picture that they have increasing difficulty in managing to survive. Sound familiar? These are the signs of the travails of empire. These are the signs of the demise of empire. Generally speaking, they come to the demise after some apogee, some peak, some incredible display of physical power. They do this because they become so concerned with every little possibility in the world that the status quo might be changed that they're willing to risk, in modern terms, trillions of dollars and lives and so forth, not just their own lives, but others' lives who they might attack in supporting this position, in order to preserve that status quo. So they will go out, for example, when an attack occurs upon them by barbarians that kills 3,000 of their citizens, mostly because of their negligence. They will go out and kill 300,000 people and spend $3 trillion in order to counter that threat to the status quo. They will then proceed throughout the world to exacerbate that threat by their own actions. Sound familiar? This is what empires do. This is what they do particularly when they're getting ready to collapse. Well, I happen to be a citizen in this empire. I happen to have been a soldier in this empire. And I happen to be very concerned about where my grandchildren and my children are going to wind up, given this current propensity to turn to force to solve every problem in the world, and to bankrupt us morally, ethically, and physically in the process. So I'm concerned with how you arrest this. Do you arrest it? Remember what I said I asked my students? Show me an empire that's survived. Show me where it's written in stone that the United States of America is guaranteed life forever. And don't bring the arguments out about us being an exceptional nation. We're an exceptional nation, all right, financially and economically, because we're blessed with 3,000 miles of basically arable land on which we can raise monstrous numbers of crops. We've got rivers galore, clean water from one end to the other, benign neighbors, and 2 big oceans. Any fool could have made a power out of what we are. So we're not an exceptional nation. What we are is a nation of people who have an exceptional ideology, an exceptional spirit for welcome, for bringing anyone from the world into our borders, for developing and making ourselves better every day, perfecting the order, if you will, building a more perfect union and so forth. That's what's exceptional about us, but that's what the empire, at the same time it's using the military instrument, at the same time it's trying to preserve the status quo, is in effect, because it has to, destroying. The most powerful entity in Washington right now, which I have brushed up against close and personal a number of times, that is doing this, of course, is the National Security Agency. The CIA is right behind them. Look at what just happened. The CIA just rendered a report by 7, 8 of its major former employees, including the head of the CIA, the deputy head of the CIA, and several other key figures that rebutted the congressional report on torture. This is against the law. You can't be a former employee of the civil service and the CIA's professional service and then go out and suddenly take a position that is against your own government in public. You can't do that. It's against the law. No one's going to punish them. No one's going to say you're wrong. Just as no one's going to hold the product of that report against which they're rebelling, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, and indeed the Inspector General of the CIA's report too, which was just as damning about torture. Just as no one's going to hold accountable the people who actually ordered the torture. Yes, we've held accountable a few of the people down at the bottom of that chain, the poor corporals and sergeants and others who had to execute those tasks. But we've not held anyone responsible who ordered the policies, watched the policies executed, and fabricated a legal framework in which those policies could be executed at all. We haven't done anything to it. This is what empires at the end do. This is what empires who have no interest in the ideology that formed them in the first place, not really, have no interest in it at all, this is what they do. You don't believe in civil liberties. You don't believe that Benjamin Franklin was right when he said that if you give up your civil liberty for a little security, you deserve neither. None of that makes any sense today. And we've had plenty of people who will stand up on podiums in Washington and tell you it doesn't make any sense. My God, we've got 17 of them in my political party right now debating each other. It doesn't make any sense. What you have to do is root those bastards out. You know, you have to go out and you have to be forceful in the world. You have to kill every threat that might come up against you. And you have to pay the money necessary to do it. Do you know what we paid in 2013, fiscal 2013, for the military instrument in this country? We paid $1.3 trillion. We didn't pay the $600 billion, which is gargantuan enough, that goes to the Pentagon. We paid $1.3 trillion. because you have to add in the $100 billion plus for intelligence. You have to add in the State Department 150 account, that's the International Relations account. You have to add in the nuclear weapons account at the Department of Energy. You have to add in the grossly underfunded but still huge account of the Veterans Affairs. You have to add in all these national security costs in order to get the total national security budget. And it's about 1.3 trillion in fiscal 2013. This is a lot of money. This is more money than all the other countries in the world allied with us and against us spend on their militaries combined. This is what we're doing with your tax money in Washington. And if you followed the headlines recently, you know they want more. They don't have enough. The Air Force, which is looking at having just acquired the most expensive airplane in the world, the F-22 Raptor, looking at the most expensive plane beyond it, the F-35 Lightning, which won't even meet 60% of the specifications the Air Force has put out for it, or the Navy, or the Marine Corps. They're looking at a bomber beyond these two planes that's going to break the bank for sure. And if that's not enough, people are going to completely break the bank because the all-volunteer force is no longer affordable. The all-volunteer force in people alone by 2027, 2028 is going to consume the entire Marine Corps and Army budget just for the people in it. That's because less than 1% of this country is going in harm's way for the other 99%. That's because the empire can't find citizen soldiers to defend it. The empire is scared of drafting those citizen soldiers because it might be an impediment to war. That is to say, if congressmen's sons and daughters, doctors and lawyers and corporate chieftains' sons and daughters were conscripted into the armed forces, the president might be a little bit more reluctant to throw those armed forces in places like Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a host of other places, probably some of which you don't even know your military is operating in right now. That's the state of your empire. That's the state of my empire. That's the state of my children and my grandchildren's empire. Not a very good state. The only way that situation is going to be altered, and I'm not sure it can. I'm not going to stand up here and give you some, Pandora's box opening up and then tell you there's some Panglossian solution to it. Or that, Peter Rabbit will jump out of a hat any moment and fix everything. Because it isn't going to happen. History tells us that we're probably finished. And then the question becomes, as it was for Britain, how do you pick up the pieces afterwards? You don't do it by re-electing Winston Churchill and making one last mad dash for empire, as he did when he joined France and Israel in invading Suez in 1956, and Dwight Eisenhower slapped his wrist and told him to get the hell out. He told the French and the Israelis the same thing. That was the end of the British Empire, period. It had begun much earlier, of course, but that was certainly the end. But Britain's done pretty well since. I recently did a show with Jeremy Greenstock, who some of you may know was Britain's representative in Baghdad, 2004, 2005, and 6. And Jeremy on that show called Britain a middling power. And afterwards I said, Jeremy, I'm glad you said that, and I didn't. And he said, it's the truth. We're a middling power. The clear reality is, we know that. Well, I'm not saying the United States' future is to be a middling power, but I am saying it's to be a power much diminished. And the real question is, how will we handle that? How will we transition from being an imperial power to being just another power in a world that's big and large and has a big GDP and so forth, probably still, but nonetheless gets along more by cooperation, more by coordination, more by joining the world rather than refusing to join the world. More by what you might call not primus inter pares, but equals. Certainly with some countries in the world whose power is growing even as ours diminishes. The most prominent out there, of course, is China, but look at India. There are some analyses, some predictions that India may surpass China in the next 20 years in terms of its economic potential if it gets its act together and stays fairly coherent and continues along democratic paths. There are other countries out there too. Brazil, Russia, of course, is still there. Huge country. I always thought a country with 11 time zones had to be reckoned with. 11 time zones. It's a huge country. If you've ever been out in the west of Russia, between Vladivostok and Moscow is such vast territory that even Alaska shrivels up. So there are other powers out there. There are other countries out there contending with us and will be contending with us. And we have incredible challenges we have to meet. Not the least of which is planetary climate change and the energy transformation that has to accompany that. Not the least of which, too, is the massive disequilibrium of wealth in the world. There was a Chinese gentleman by the name of Wilkerson who started out as Sun Yat-sen and was a Democrat, so to speak. And then Sun Yat-sen collapsed and the republic collapsed and Wilkerson became a communist and joined Mao in the Long March. And then he got disenchanted with communism, as most people would who have a brain. And he said, I think I'll be a poet and a writer. And so he spent the rest of his life basically writing poems and short stories and so forth. But he had something to say that was really trenchant. He said, you can sit around the table all day long and you can talk about politics, and you can talk about social issues, and you can talk about almost anything. And you can have a reasonable discussion with a reasonable person. But start talking about the maldistribution of wealth, and you better get your gun. Well, that's where we are. We're there in Europe, and we're here in the United States. If you've read Thomas Piketty, the French economist's book, Capital in the 21st century, you know what I'm talking about. You know that France, for example, is in 1789, and we're in 1929 in terms of the maldistribution of wealth. Well, you know what happened after 1789 in France, the Revolution of Napoleon, and you know what happened in 1929 in the United States. And Piketty will contend the situations in both countries are worse today than they were then. 0.001% of the people in the United States, not talking about the top 10%, not even talking about the top 1%, own the equivalent in wealth of the GDP of Brazil. Think about that for a moment. Ask yourself the question, what does the other 300 million people get by on? It's a huge question. The disequilibrium, the maldistribution in this country right now is terrible. That alone is enough internally to bring us down. You know, John Adams said there never was a democracy yet that didn't commit suicide, and Abraham Lincoln said all the armies of Napoleon or any other dictator will never cross the Appalachians and defeat us. We will defeat ourselves if we are to be defeated. Abe, we're defeating ourselves. Adams's comment was probably as poignant as any. Democracies tend to go to special interests. Special interests tend to vote themselves the budget. Once they've voted themselves the budget, the country in which they're established disappears or has a really hard time. That's a simplistic way to look at it, but that's what's happening to us. In addition to using the military instrument too much, in addition to all the other trappings, all the other things that indicate the empire is in decline. Natural decline and forced decline. Bad decision-making, most catastrophic decision in America's history probably was to invade Iraq in 2003. Look at what we unleashed. Just look at what we unleashed. I spent my military career trying to achieve strategically a balance in the Persian Gulf of power that would prohibit fighting and instability like we see today. Spent my life in the military doing that. And then I come in to serve an administration that destroys that balance of power in one fell swoop and does nothing to reestablish it. And then backs out and says, okay, I'm not going to deal with you, Iran, because I've made you the new hegemon in the Persian Gulf. By my own actions, I've made you the most powerful country in the region because I've removed your principal enemy. And now I'm going to back out and do nothing about you because you're evil. You're evil. And then along comes the president who decides he's going to reverse that and talk to the Iranians and maybe solve some other problems too, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and a host of other lesser ones. And my party in the Congress fights him tooth and nail to keep him from doing it. This is what empires in decline do. They cannot even govern themselves. And when you can't govern yourself, when you can't take care of your people's problems, when you can't have universal health care like every other established democracy in the world has achieved, if you can't do the things for your own people that you need to do, what you do is you go abroad and you fight other people. And you distract your own people by doing that. These are all signs of the collapse of empire, and they're all with us every single day of the week. All you have to do is pay attention. And what do we do about it? As I said, we can manage the decline and come out at the other end, not a middling power, but a real democracy, a real republic that has democratic tendencies. I like to say that because we're not a real democracy, not really. Not like Athens was. Although Athens too was built on what? Slavery. Any familiar tone there? Any familiar note there? They were built on slavery, the Helots. And we were built on slavery. There's a big argument in the historical community at William and Mary right now as to whether northern manufacturing or southern slavery was the top element in our GDP from 1800 to 1845. I vote for slavery. So in many respects, we were built on the back of black people, slaving away in the South. But we solved, at least for political purposes, that problem with a lot of blood. Now we think as many as 1 million casualties, not the 600,000 I was taught, but closer to 1 million casualties in our Civil War. Good forensic research has determined that. And then we solved the rest of it 100 years later with the Civil Rights Act, but we still haven't solved it because look at what you saw with that freak show that is my Republican Party debating itself the other day. We just transferred the mantle to Muslims. And don't get me wrong, we haven't solved in the Republican Party or in this country race relations with anybody yet. Still real problems. And militarizing our law enforcement entities, as we've seen so vividly demonstrated in places like Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, is not the answer to that problem. But that's what empires in decline do. That's what they do. They take your liberties away, your freedoms away, they become more and more draconian, and they concentrate more and more on the instrument of force, and eventually the world grows tired of them and discards them. That is, if they don't implode themselves before the world does it. So we go on, and we transition, and we do it carefully and methodically over the next 25, 30 years. And we gear up to meet the challenges that are rolling down the road towards us by cooperating with other countries in the world, which is absolutely essential if we're going to meet those challenges. What difference does it make if we meet the challenges in America but don't meet them in China? Don't meet them in Brazil, don't meet them in Russia. We're a very small portion, really, of the total world population. So if we don't meet them pretty much comprehensively, we're not going to meet them at all. And that goes big time for climate change. I'm a member of something called the Climate Security Working Group in Washington. It is a group commissioned by the Department of Defense. And we did something called sea rise tables. This is just based on what the scientists are telling us, particularly at NASA, about sea rise over the next 25 years. And we gave those to the installation commanders on our coast. Those installation commanders at Norfolk, Virginia, at Mayport, Florida, at Treasure Island, California, in San Diego and elsewhere, are going to have to spend billions of your dollars in order to build abatement facilities to keep the water out or to relocate, because they can't stay there. In some cases, it's relocation because no abatement facilities are going to do the job. Too expensive. We've had the Dutch, we've had others in, who have experience with this to talk to us about how to do it, about how expensive it is and so forth. I'll give you a little clue here that we discovered. Miami in the next 25 years is basically going to disappear. Unless they do the abatement, which is something in the neighborhood of $16, $17 billion, or unless they relocate, Miami is going to have real problems. So are some other countries. North Carolina has already spent money trying to relocate some of the most biodiverse marshland on its coast 2.5 miles inland, so it won't be contaminated, it won't be ruined. But that's only a temporary measure, very expensive, but a temporary measure. Sea rise is here. Whether humans are contributing to it or not is irrelevant. Well, it's not irrelevant. It's here. It's coming. Your military is allocating billions of dollars to disaster relief, to humanitarian assistance that 20 years ago it never contemplated. Why? Because it believes NASA, when NASA tells it that there's going to be a 100-year storm, a storm like Katrina, every 10 years now, rather than every century. Well, that means you have to have lots of more money for your ships, your relief supplies, and so forth. If you're going to help Bangladesh, you're going to help Indonesia, you're going to help Japan, you're going to help all these countries, including your own, who are subject to tsunamis, typhoons, hurricanes, and so forth. Because it's going to happen once every decade instead of once every century. Just use your math. That's 10 times more money you're going to need. It's devastating for the Navy in particular because they have to think about this incredible increase in order to help people through their disaster relief and humanitarian assistance mission portfolio. And they do that. You know, we did it in Bangladesh, we did it in Indonesia, somewhere, as I recall, in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000. I'm not sure they even have a solid count on it, really. Very spread out archipelago, as you know, very difficult to govern, very difficult to secure, very difficult to get assistance out to. United States Navy, Philippine Navy, and others in the region, very important to keeping people alive out there. So it's extremely threatening to the budget of the Navy and to the budget of the armed forces in general, and that's why they're on top of this matter. In fact, I'll tell you the truth, it scares me. The only department in your government in Washington that is clearly and completely seized with the idea that climate change is real and in front of us is the Department of Defense. That itself is a comment on what we've become inside the Beltway. The only strategic, far-reaching thinking going on in the United States government is in the Department of Defense. This is not the way it should be. This is not the way a power that wants to endure should be leading itself. It's the exact opposite. I could go on, but I'm sure that I have dismayed you enough at this point. I hope your little gray cells, as Hercule Poirot says all the time, are percolating. And at least I've challenged you to think about some of these issues. They aren't easy, they're complex. That's one of the phenomena, I think, that accompanies modernity, is that things are getting awfully difficult to deal with, awfully complex. That's why we're running around trying to create quantum computers and, you know, parallel computers and all this other stuff, which I've been privy to in the cyber world at least, and as scared of in some respects as I am of any of these other threats. This idea of artificial intelligence that may someday be smarter than us and we can't handle it and so forth, which you've seen in the movies, I've seen up close. I've seen what the NSA can do, for example, with artificial intelligence that already exists. If you're familiar with the trilogy of Lisbeth's, the girl with the dragon tattoo, if you're familiar with that riveting tale in the 3 books that were written, and of course the author died, and now another one is out, written by a guy who knew a lot about the author's technique and so forth. It's called The Girl in the Spiderweb. It's Lisbeth again, Lisbeth Salander again. And it's got a lot of this in it. In fact, one of the arch villains in the novel is the NSA. But most Americans read that and they get titillated by it. They get, you know, they get, oh man, this is riveting. I mean, I couldn't put the book down. It's a big book and I read it in about 12 hours. I couldn't put it down. That's my wife. But I wasn't necessarily rooted by the NSA's role in it because I know about it. Indeed, I used it to go after North Korea for 3.5 years. I know what they can do. I know what they can do to you and to me. And I know how little oversight is exercised over them because I'll tell you why. In basic terms, no one in your government is experienced and talented and capable enough to exercise oversight. Why did Edward Snowden get what he got and go away with it? Because no one understood what his capabilities were. We're putting up a new family of satellites that cost over $100 billion, and there is absolutely no one in the United States Congress, elected or professional staff, who knows what Lockheed is doing. It's too complicated. I've had senators, representatives, and staffers tell me that. At one point, we had 3 people in the Congress, on the professional staff, who knew how to challenge the defense contractors on satellites. We have no one now. So you have to believe them. You have to say, of course we need those new satellites. Oh, of course we need satellites up there that can give us real-time video, that can dwell, that can look into your bathroom and see you, that can stay there and take photos of you as well as streaming video. And, oh, by the way, we need drones that can do that too. And it'll only be 1.6 trillion. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. There's no one that can challenge it. No one that can challenge it. They don't have the technical expertise to do so. They just have to believe the defense contractors. And I'll tell you something. Many of them don't have the technical expertise to know what they're doing either. So the Edward Snowdens beneath them are actually doing it. I'm not trying to be down on Edward Snowden. I'm simply saying that that's how technical and how difficult it has become in the world to oversee that technology, and that's another complication of government. Anyway, let me stop and take your questions because I know that some of you may have some, because I hope I've generated a few. Maybe even I've generated some anger, some angst, or whatever out there, and some interest in do I know what I'm talking about, and can you get at it even more than I just did?
Hi.
Please.
You've engendered, what do you call it? Just depression. That's what it is. Okay, I'm not sure it's just angst. What would you tell a young man or woman intent on entering the military today?
Same thing I tell my kids at William & Mary, and I did at George Washington and others. My daughter served. My son is in the Air Force right now. He's a Reaper drone pilot. I love it that you're there because you're highly moral. You have a strong sense of citizenship, and I'd rather have you there than all the bums I know that could be there. And I tell my students, if I feel that way about them, and I do generally about my students, I tell them go. I put them in the NSA, I put them in the CIA, I put them in the DIA, and when they come to me and they say, I've been recruited by the CIA, and they look at me like, oh, he's going to say something. And I say, good, go to work for him.
So you want the positive reinforcement out there.
I want the good people
society.
there. I want the people there who are going to stand up and say, you can't do that, it's against the law, and I'm going to blow a whistle on you. That's what I want.
I got you. Okay, thank you. What about them and their chance of being destroyed within in a culture like that?
Yeah, it's tough. I have a young lady right now, 4.4 in Arabic. She was so fluent in Arabic that they wanted to give her native speaker status at the NSA. She went to work there. She's been there 5 years now. Every year she would come to me and say, can we have dinner somewhere or lunch? I got to talk to you. I need to leave. These people are terrible. And I would say, Alexa, come on. Tell me what the problem is. And generally it would be her immediate boss. And I would tell her how to deal with that. And she would get shifted, or she'd go to that boss's boss and get that boss in trouble. And she's still there. She's been promoted and she's doing well. And I'm comfortable she's there.
So you encourage your students then and people around you to worm into the system and
Yes.
see what it is and destroy it from within if
Yes.
possible.
For too long, the cream, for too long, the cream of our universities has been going to Wall Street, or the equivalent.
Yes.
We need the cream going back into the government. That's one way to begin to correct this ship of state.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Surely. Yes.
With so much misinformation being disseminated by what you say, the corporate media and so forth, how does the average person try to keep themselves warm? What are
Superb,
some good things that
superb question. Yeah, if you didn't hear it, how do you stay informed if the media is owned by corporate interests? The best way to do it, in my view, is to read the foreign press. And you got to be selective, and you got to find which press is good, which isn't. In France, for example, there are a couple of papers. Le Monde is not too bad. In England, there are a couple of papers. Financial Times, I read the Financial Times every time I can pick it up, and not for its economic and financial advice, though I sometimes look at that. I look at what it says, which is always just right on the money. I might not agree with it, but it's right on the money in terms of the precision and incisiveness with which it's delivered about China, about the interest in China, both security, foreign policy, and economic trade and so forth, and about Russia. Financial Times is a great newspaper. There are a few of them left. The internet has some good sources too, but you have to really work to find them. But foreigners generally report accurately about the United States, whereas we generally obfuscate, lie, don't tell the whole truth, whatever. It's incredible if you read the foreign press for a long time, you'll get a lot of the image that others have of us. And that image is probably closer to the truth than the image we have of ourselves. It's that simple.
What happens when your message starts to get traction? And what I mean by that is, there are a lot of us, let's say, in the blogosphere that's been spilling this message for quite some time. But the question is, because it doesn't have a whole lot of coverage right now, nobody needs to be afraid. The defense industrial complex doesn't need to be afraid. What happens when you go around the country and start telling the message and somebody of your stature actually brings it to the fore? What happens to you? What happens to others who are actually telling this truth?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I haven't been shot yet. Sometimes this latest business with AIPAC and Israel has really got me into the realm of email receipts that I never imagined I'd be in. And recently I wrote an op-ed for the Huffington Post about Dr. Carson and Donald Trump's remarks, or failure to make remarks about Muslims. And I had just received a number of emails from soldiers and Marines, all of whom were Muslim, who were asking me to weigh in. They simply said, one Marine captain from Jordanian American, said, I can't believe this. I can't believe I've fought in Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. I'm a good Marine. I'm a captain. I lead an entire company of Marines, and I've got Republican candidates saying that a Muslim shouldn't be president, or talking derisively about Muslims and so forth. I can't believe that. Can you write something? And after the 10th or 12th email like that, I decided I better write something. Not that it was very important, but I had to get it out there. But I've gotten some really filthy emails since then about everything from my being I won't repeat it. Pretty filthy stuff. But a more general answer to your question is keep going, keep working, because we're going to change. We are going to change this country, or we're going to die with it. I don't think there's any other alternative. We're either going to change it or we're going to go down with it. And if we go down with it, then we can still try to get it to be that power I was talking about in the transition. The sad thing about empires that are extremely powerful, like we have been since 45, is that they usually go in a real bust. And you say, how could we go in a real bust? Well, there was a book written a few years ago about the 9 nations of North America. Texas featured prominently in that book because it was the leader of one of the 9 nations of North America. We think it can't happen. We think this country can't break up. I can tell you right now, I've been in the Deep South where I have listened to governors and legislative members who talk about leaving the Union. Generally, I say, well, to Alabama or Mississippi, I'll say, or my home state of South Carolina, I'll say, have you seen the stats on the GDP? You're a -4%. If it weren't for New York at a +30 and California at a +60, and the transfer of revenues from those 2 productive states to your state, you wouldn't exist. You'd be Bangladesh or worse. And they go, oh, where'd you get those figures? Give them to them. Show them the figures. That's the truth. That's how bad some of these states are doing economically. So, you know, the idea they would leave is kind of preposterous. But then think about it for a minute and think about something like that book proposed some years ago, that there'd be these confluence of interests that would meld, and you'd have a Pacific Northwest state, and you'd have an East Coast state, you'd have a Deep South state, you'd have Texas, and so forth. And think about history and the motive forces thereof, and you realize that this last 1,000 years and this last 200 in particular have been especially stable. With all the wars and everything they've fought, they've still been especially stable. People would argue the last 1,000 years have been incredibly, the last millennium has been incredibly conducive to the human race, which is why we've put more people on this planet since 1900 than we did in all the years prior. That's going away. It's going away. It's going away in terms of rainfall. It's going away in terms of water in general. It's going away in terms of arable land. It's going away in terms of acidification of the oceans. It's going away in terms of climate change. We're going to have to fight tooth and nail. One NASA climatologist threw up a screen for me the other day that showed what he thought was the worst scenario. By the end of 2100, there'd be enough arable land, given that things were more or less static, which they certainly won't be. I mean, we'll have technological development and so forth in the interim, but nonetheless, if they were static, we'd have enough arable land for about 400 million people. And my first question was, where do you bury 9 billion people? How do you do it? Do you cremate them all? How do you handle that? That's an outlandish scenario, perhaps, but it's within the realm of the possible. If we don't do something, if we aren't successful even in what we do, we could have a real tough time. The whole human race could have a really tough time over the next century. That's a reality. Anyone who tries to claim that is not reality is speaking in the face of the majority of scientists on this planet. I was recently in Syracuse, Sicily, where we met with some of these scientists from all across the globe. And the only thing they debated was how deep, how fast, and how devastating. They all said it's coming.
I believe we could save billions, maybe even trillions of dollars in war machines and fighting wars, but I believe there's a much, much simpler, easier way to improve our national security with little effort. And I would like to suggest this to you after listening to you tonight, and if you think it means anything, I would really be grateful that you reach some Americans with common sense and maybe carry this through. And going back during the Clinton administration, the group of secret group, special interest groups, they recruited a lot of corrupt Iraqis under Ahmed Chalabi, and they spend, of course it took momentum under Bush, but they spent $90 million for these people to come up and forge and lie and fabricate information about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and everything else. And we spent all that, and it was under Ahmed Chalabi, and his nephew, by the way, is in Sugar Land. He's a cardiologist. And he was the head of the Iraq Liberation Committee, and of course all the others were born natural Americans here. But they did, and they caused all this trouble there. Now, with that money, that much, $90 million, if you could go to Washington or somewhere, raise it, I believe there is a way to solve much of the problems that we have in the Middle East right now. And that is, in 2011, I scheduled a conference in London, and reserved hotels and conference and everything. And and invited the common sense Iraqis from all regions of Iraq, not the ones involved in conflicts, in wars, in resistance, but these are intellectuals and other people to come to London, and we can openly, under peaceful circumstances, discuss. And only thing that prevented them, none of them could afford it, and that's the only reason we canceled the conference. So if you spend get $90 million or whatever, and I believe for certain that you can bring in these sensible Iraqis, for instance, and if you could succeed in Iraq, you could succeed in Syria, and if you could succeed in Syria, you could do it also in Libya and other places. Down there, they cannot meet. Absolutely, under those circumstances, they cannot meet. Bring it to London. I don't believe they should bring it to Washington because there wouldn't be it will not be the atmosphere for them to really try it. So if you think something like this could be done, I'll be more than happy to work with you, but I'm certain you could find a lot of Iraqi intellectuals, you know, that would like to solve this problem, and I believe the problem is easy. And by the way, I come from the city of Nineveh, that's Mosul, which is Daesh. ISIS has taken over it. And my family who've been there for centuries, they're all refugees now. They escaped the city. So it's really traumatic. And I hope you could consider this thing here, and I'll be happy to exchange information with you. But I believe it could be done, you know.
Thank you.
A lot less than spending
Yeah, thank you for your
billions. Thank you.
I don't know how you would logistically accomplish that, just thinking about what you said. But I take your points about Ahmad Chalabi and how he distorted the whole picture in 2001, 2, and 3. And we're doing the same thing again right now with the Mujahideen al-Kaq, who are in Washington lobbying for us to go to war with Iran. They remind me of Chalabi and the Iraqi Congress and so forth. I think this is just my view, and you can take it for what it's worth. Through trial and error, what's happening right now with regard to probably the worst conflict in Southwest Asia, Syria, civil war. Russia, Turkey, Iran, Riyadh probably, but I'm not sure about Riyadh, and the United States are holding secret talks. What you're seeing right now about Putin moving military equipment into Syria, what you're seeing right now about Erdogan in Turkey and Ankara taking on the Kurdish terrorists rather than the Daesh forces and so forth, is in some respects a smokescreen. It's very real and it's very deadly, and I'm not condoning it, but for these secret talks, which are going to work out an interim political agreement that will keep Assad in power for a short time at least, and solve the problem of refugees, solve the problem of conflict, and generally bring some stability back to Syria. France also is involved as a sort of junior partner right now because of the history France has with Syria. That's probably the political solution we're going to see, that this president has effected much the way he did in secret with Bill Burns in Oman, the Iran agreement. There were lots of talks going on for a long time before we got to Geneva and before we got to the P5+1 and so forth. I think that's what's happening. And I think within the scope, the framework of current politics and power, that's probably the best way to be solving the Syria problem right now. And it is a problem that is rapidly destabilizing the whole region. When I was in Syracuse, one of the Jordanian royal family who recognized from my introduction that I had been with Powell came up to me and he put his finger in my chest and he said, "You go back to the United States and you tell Coleman, my dear friend, Coleman, that there is an Iraqi or a Syrian family in every single home in Jordan." And I think it's probably true for southern Lebanon too, he said, though I don't know exactly. That's extremely destabilizing. It's not good for Israel, Israel's midterm, long-term security at all. In fact, it's a grievous threat to that security. So we got to get this problem solved, and I think within the possibility, the framework of the possible right now, that's the way to do it, these secret talks and the sharing of a solution. Yes.
Now that we know what your message is from this speech, you talked at first about how many places you'd actually given this talk. How are our allies, and maybe not so much allies, how are they affected by the fact that you're telling them that we're falling apart?
Good question. Mostly I find they already know it and are worried and are doing something. In Tokyo, for example, Prime Minister Abe is fast making Japan a normal country. In Japanese, that's what his phrase means. It's really normalcy. It's kind of an odd noun. We invented it actually back in the Hoover period, you know. They used that term translated. He's busily making Japan full of power. Is he doing this because he covets the 1,000 nuclear weapons he could make in a nanosecond? Japan is so loaded with plutonium right now, it could make 1,000 weapons probably in 6 months, put them on missiles in a year, and have a full-up ICBM complex. Why is he doing this? Well, it's not just power. It's not just Prime Minister Abe's desire to have Japan be a counter to China and so forth. That's part of it. It's because he sees the United States promise withering on the vine. For a half century plus, the United States has guaranteed Japan, if you don't rearm, if you don't have a real military that goes around the world and does things, then we'll protect you. And oh, our nuclear shield will be over you. That's how the Allies are reacting. And some say in this country, with some reason, it's good. It's time our allies began to take some of this burden off of us, particularly in Europe. They point at Europe and they say, because the Japanese have always paid their way. The Japanese paid about half the price for most of our wars. Saudis paid the other half, if it was in their region. Chinese are paid too, of course, by buying our debt. But the Europeans are really worried. And they don't seem to be reacting like the Japanese. They tend to just stick their head in the ground and, you know, oh, the United States will protect us, they'll come back. You know, oh, Putin's getting closer and closer. It's really weird to be in Berlin or Paris or London and hear them. They just don't want to shoulder the burden of being more capable themselves. They want to spend 1-2% of GDP. They don't want to go to 3 or 4 or 5% of GDP. And, you know, there's an argument that we ought to let them. We ought to make them grow up and let them defend themselves and so forth and be less dependent on us. At the same time, though, that means you lose power over them. You lose political, diplomatic, and other power over them. You even lose trade and economic power over them because they tend to challenge you more. They tend to want to sell their airplanes to China rather than you doing it. And so it's a mixed bag. But that's basically the rest of the world has awakened to the fact that the United States is, one, strategically inept, and two, not the power it used to be. And that the trend is to increase that.
I have a question. Earlier you mentioned, and I know these aren't the only problems that you mentioned, but you talked about national debt and military spending. And in January of this year, I finished a 5-year tour of service in the Navy. And for 2 years...
I won't thank you for your service, but I'll thank you for your sacrifice. That's what a triple amputee at Walter Reed said to me one day in the presence of 6 congressmen. Triple amputee, his right arm below the elbow and both legs above the knee. And they started to thank him for his service, and he said, "Don't thank me for my service, I'm conflicted over that. Thank me for my sacrifice, which you can clearly see." I'll never forget that.
Well, I appreciate it. But something I noticed, because I spent 2 of those 5 years as an RPPO, as a repair parts petty officer.
Right.
Which basically meant that I just got consumables and things to repair our equipment. I ordered those things through our logistics system. And something that I noticed was that we spend, for things that I would buy for myself, right? things that the military needs that I would also buy for myself, like 3-hole punches, paper, printers, and those kinds of things. We spend significantly more on those things than a normal person would spend.
$600 toilet seats.
Right, $600 toilet seats. And I just have wondered for a long time how much of our military spending that we could mitigate by not contracting those things. I do understand that there are certain things that are highly specified and they have to be manufactured specifically for that purpose, but not all things do. And I also know that the federal government is afraid of consumer favoritism, but I just wonder if you have a better solution for that.
You're right, and internal audits show 10 to 12% of a $600 billion budget is probably wasted in the way you just described. And you do the numbers there, that's a lot of money. And it's part because Congress is in cahoots with it. For example, we could have done security assistance in Iraq for about 1/5 the cost it cost us had we used Iraqis. But Congress legislated that we had to use U.S. contractors. Congress legislates that 2/3 or more, it's usually more, of U.S. aid's budget, the development arm of the United States foreign policy, has to be spent in the United States. Well, U.S. aid could save a fortune in Senegal, in Sierra Leone, almost anywhere else in the world except maybe London or Paris, if it used local contractors. But it can't. The Congress prohibits that. It has to use U.S. contractors. Imagine the security costs alone of moving U.S. contractors into a conflict zone and having to pay them not only their enormous salaries, but also for their security, either by diverting American troops or private contractors. Increasingly the case, there were 200,000 private contractors in Iraq. Another way we go to war and don't have to pay attention to the end strength of the armed forces is to augment that end strength with private contractors. We put more private contractors in Iraq at one point than we had soldiers and Marines. And guess what that creates in the military? You probably know this. When you're paying that contractor $100,000 a year to drive that truck that the private's driving for $30,000 a year, you create a real morale problem with that private. Not only that, that contractor can wear his firearms and go into a bar in Baghdad and drink himself silly. He can even shoot somebody, and he's not subject to Iraqi or U.S. military justice. But that soldier can't drink, and he can't wear his firearm into a bar if he went in there to get a soda or something. And he can be prosecuted for anything he does. You imagine the morale problem that creates with our soldiers and Marines in Afghanistan and Iraq. And yet we do it. We do it because Bechtel and SAIC and others who provide those contractors get paid billions to do it. Your problem is acute. It could be solved. It could be solved if the Congress exercised its oversight, like, for example, Harry Truman did during World War II, in his Senate capacity as an investigator of fraud in business and industry. It could be done. It isn't, because it's very lucrative for everyone concerned.
Do you have any advice for college students, and what do you think you would do if you were a college student today?
Ooh, that's a deep one. Well, let me give you I'll call him by his first name, Harrison. One of the most brilliant students I've had ever in the military, where I taught for 6 years. GW, I taught for 6, we've been married for 10 now. He came into my office and he said, I have an offer from Goldman Sachs. I'll be making $250,000 in the first year, plus bonuses. In 5 years, I'll be making $300,000 plus bonuses, and the bonuses might be over $1 million. I have no doubt that what they've told me, and I had no doubt that what they told him was probably true. I said, Harrison, you wanted to go into public service. You wanted to go into the Peace Corps, or you wanted to go into public service somewhere inside the Beltway. DIA, CIA, whatever. I was confronted by the very phenomenon we had studied at William and Mary, how 25% or greater of the Ivy Leagues had gone to Wall Street. I said, Harrison, you can't do this to me. He said, I'm going to go and I'm going to make $5 or $6 million so I'll be comfortable, and then I'll do my public service. I said, Harrison, you won't leave. In 5 or 6 years, if I'm still alive, you be sure you contact me. In fact, contact me every year just to give me a readout, because I don't think you're coming back. That's what I would say. Don't be so attracted by the money. You can go back and do the money anytime you want to. You can be comfortable, but do something else. Do something that's going to make you feel good about yourself. Do something. I had a young man call me. It was roughly 2 months after the Baghdad statue fell. We hadn't seen things turning terrible yet, but they were looking like they might. He was a graduate of Northwestern, undergraduate, had an MA from Cambridge, and had gotten a law degree from Harvard. He was working for Drinker, Biddle, and Reed in Washington. He was making this guy's 26 years old, making $300,000 that year. He was reading international business contracts 18 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, commenting on them, advising, and so forth and so on. He was really making a point. He called me at the State Department. I'd known him from previous days. And he said, get me out of here. I'm making lots of money, but I can't stand it. Money is not everything in the world. I want to do something. I want to do something for my country. I want to do something in the public domain. I said, Matt, how would you like to go to Iraq? He said, Iraq? Yeah, sure. Long story short, he went to Iraq. He was there 4 years. He wound up being David Petraeus' political advisor in the end. Then he went to Afghanistan, where he still is. He's been there 3 years, and he is the advisor to ISAF for political issues. And he is making a difference. He's making a difference in an incredibly challenging environment, but he's making a difference. And he's happy. He ain't making a lot of money, but he's happy. He's doing public service.
Thank you.
Yeah, during the Republican debate last week, in the closing statements, 3 or 4 candidates probably mentioned Israel along with the United States. They trip over themselves to call the Israeli Prime Minister by his nickname, Bibi. I don't know that many Democrats would be so different. So there's, is in your mind something out of whack in terms of our, seems to be one-sided support for Israel. Is it in the national interest of this country?
No, it's not. And it's not in the national interest of Israel, ultimately. George Washington said it best when we were so embattled over France and England. And we were probably going to go to war with one or the other or both right after our revolution led up to, of course, the phony war with France and then the war with Britain in 1812. Don't ever become so enamored of another nation that it becomes your interest. You know, their interest becomes your interest and vice versa. I think Washington's warning was absolutely exquisite, and it applies today. We cannot make Israel's interest our interest, nor should they make ours theirs. And yet that's what we've done. That's what we've done. We have simply got to get out from that for Israel's sake as well as our own. Prime Minister Netanyahu has a very short-term vision for Israel, and that vision is a neoconservative vision, if I may use that term with regard to Israelis. It's driven by a lot of the Russian immigrants he has, who have a really hardcore attitude about force. It was already there, intrinsic in the Israeli makeup. You know, the old historical adage about the oppressed becomes the oppressor more often than not. There's some truth to that. The Israelis are, in all intents and purposes, conducting a state exactly the way Jimmy Carter intimated. It's increasingly an apartheid state. And they're going to destroy themselves if they don't watch out. And the chaos that's been created around them, particularly in Syria, Netanyahu thinks is comforting. I beg to differ with you. It is not comforting to me, because it looks like if it gets out of hand any further, it may threaten the very existence of the state of Israel. I don't think he sees that. He thinks force is the ultimate answer. Israel has the biggest fist, bring them all on, and he'll kill them all.
Okay. mentioned that we are one of the only modernized countries that doesn't offer universal health care.
Or some facsimile thereof.
All right. I read an article the other day posted by the Wall Street Journal, which I tried to avoid anyways, but it was about Bernie Sanders. It was bashing Bernie Sanders as, he wants to use a single payer system for the whole country.
Yeah.
They said that he would be spending $18 trillion more on top of what we already have. And I also read a rebuttal that said otherwise, that said that it would be over 10 years, $15 trillion that we're already going to spend anyways, and would actually save us $5 trillion. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned that his home state of Vermont was having a hard time implementing a single payer system. On a national scale, do you agree with the fact that it would, do you agree with the economics that it would actually save us money, or do you think that it is actually going to add $18 trillion? And also, how would you think we should implement such a single payer system nationally?
Well, let me say right off the bat, I'm not an expert on it, okay? That's my disclaimer. That said, I've read a lot about it, and Powell and I have had tremendous discussions and debates about it, because he's in favor, I think it's fair to say, shouldn't put words in his mouth, but I think it's fair to say that he's more or less leaning towards single bill payment. Medicare writ large.
Yes.
The countries like Finland and Norway and Sweden and others, Germany, who have implemented this and implemented it very, very economically and very successfully, are very different from us. First, they're smaller. Second, they're more cohesive. They're having trouble with that cohesion right now because of all the immigration, but they are more cohesive. It's a different problem for them. It's a different challenge. So just throwing them out, as I just did, as examples of how you could do it, is really not fair, probably, in the long run. That said, we're composed of 50 entities that aren't too different from them. I mean, Texas may be a little bit bigger. Iran is 4 times the size of Texas. Most Americans don't have a clue of that. Much bigger than Iraq. 75 million people, all of whom are very cohesive. 51% Persian, they ought to be. So every country's different. We're very different in that sense. But we're similar in terms of 50 states. So the way I would approach it is state by state, but try to do it in some kind of comprehensive way that eventually is linked nationally, linked to some kind of economic, financial standard, if you will, and some kind of policy that keeps the healthcare industry, which is as predatory as any industry on the face of this earth, and that includes doctors, out of it, the way Obama didn't do. The Affordable Health Care Act was essentially written by the healthcare industry. You have to keep them out because they're contaminated. They cannot give you any good advice. There are a few doctors out there who could, who still subscribe to the Hippocratic Oath and other things. And I'm not trying to put doctors down. I'm just saying, your country right now is trying to recruit Cuban doctors out of the barrios in Venezuela by offering them huge amounts of money. These are the first doctors who've been in Venezuela's ghettos in the history of Venezuela. And we're so crass that we're trying to go down there and recruit them to bring them to the United States and pay them lots of money. And of course, some of them are leaving because money is a very attractive thing. But that's not what you want in a physician, really. You don't want the incentive for money and profit. You want the incentive to help people and to care for people. And you want to spend money on young people as well as people in the last 6 months of their lives. We spend more money on people in the last 6 months of their lives because they can pay than we do on all the babies in the country. This is a broken system. So you go state by state fixing it. You take 20 years if you need to, but you go state by state. You make sure it's working in the state. You make sure they get the help they need from the federal government if they do. And then when you've got all that going, you somehow link it up. If you need to, you may not need to. You may just need to regulate it. Alabama's not going to have as good a system as California. Or I would say New York. There are wealthier states. They can do things that Alabama and Mississippi can't do. And Alabama and Mississippi are still full of, frankly, blatant racism. So is my state of South Carolina. Blacks in South Carolina are disenfranchised. They're everything but disemboweled every day of the year. And some of them are disemboweled. And it still goes on in my state. I'm clear-eyed enough to know that. Not to say that it doesn't go on in northern states too, it does, but it's not quite as crass as it is down there, and it's not so much connected to the very impoverishment of the state and the people. You got to do it, I think, differently, is what I'm saying. And you got to do it over time, and you got to do it carefully. You can't do it by fiat, which is my objection to the way President Obama did. Now, I have to say too, my students are sometimes surprised when I play this grainy old film and this tape of Harry Truman. He's just become president. He's just given his condolences to Eleanor Roosevelt for her husband's death, and she said, "You're the one who needs condolences." Yeah. He gives his first address to Congress, and guess what a component of it is? Universal health care, along with housing for the poor. Read that address. It is a startling address because it outdoes FDR. And there are people in the Congress on both sides of the political aisle who are just stunned. They don't know what to do with this guy. This guy wants to really take the benefits that had accrued because of World War II and the economy he intuitively knew was coming once it was controlled. We were going to have the most productive years in our history, and tie it to all the people, not just the wealthy. Now, a year later, he turns around because of what? Because of NSC 68, because of actions of the national security elite that said Russia was a really big threat. You got to support Greece and Turkey, and then the Koreans come along and attack South Korea, and Harry turns around, and we go from, get this now, try to conceptualize this in constant dollars, in today's dollars. We go from Harry demanding $13 billion for the budget to demanding $54 billion for the budget, the defense budget. This is the greatest increase in defense spending in American history. And it doesn't happen necessarily because of Korea. Ask the GIs who fought in Korea. They didn't get squat hardly. What it happens is because NSC 68 is being fleshed out to fight the Cold War. And we're beefing up NATO, we're beefing up Europe, we're beefing up our defenses there, our installations there, our Air Force there, and everything else. We're fighting Korea on the cheap while we're doing all this to stand off against the Soviets because we feared they'd take advantage of Korea, attack across the central plain of Europe, and so forth. Harry is very much, he's even in favor of universal military training, and so is George Marshall. And what really stops him is not so much the 14th Amendment and all the other things that people talk about today, and the business of, you and I had to take my son, and now it's son or daughter. If you had a draft, you'd have to draft women too. It's really money. Because when they sit down and they look at the number of people vulnerable to the draft every year and think about having to pay them a salary, it breaks the bank. And so universal military training really never gets off the ground. But Harry is ready to do universal health care in 1948. Actually, he's ready to do it in 1944, but it really takes off in terms of development and planning and all that in 48. And it just goes away because it can't be done politically. Too much opposition. That's a long answer, but I do think it's a different situation for us. I think it's unfair probably to compare us with Norway or Finland or Sweden or Germany, France even. And it's different in each of those countries. If you've ever been subject to their national health service. In England, I've had a good experience in England. I've had a good experience in France. Not so good of an experience in Germany, but I'm sure it was just because of the particular place I was at the time. So, you get a little bit of this, a little bit of that. If you're not a billionaire, if you're just an average Joe like me, you don't go to the doctor. I haven't been to the doctor in 10 years. My wife hasn't been to the doctor in 15. We don't want to. It's too expensive. And we have TRICARE for life. We have Medicare and TRICARE for life. When I screwed my knee up, I had to have surgery. I went out to Walter Reed. I found a colonel I knew, and I said, hey, you're an orthopedic surgeon, aren't you? And he said, yeah. I said, I just screwed my knee up really bad. He did some x-rays, and he said, yep, check in tomorrow, do the surgery. I don't know what it cost the government. It didn't cost me a penny. I mean, that's what veterans of 30 years in the armed forces ought to get, but that was because I knew somebody. It wasn't because I was going to get it automatically.
Well, then I guess I should be grateful for my Texas state health care, because I just went to the doctor one day. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Let's give Colonel Wilkerson